everyone. Welcome back. I'm Rachel, your host for Everybody Has Stuff. Thank you for joining me again on another episode here. And today I really wanted to kind of take it back to what we were kind of talking about over previous episodes. And a lot of the themes there tend to stem from guilt and shame. So honestly, I really thought that this was important because I don't know everybody really truly understands what guilt and shame is. I don't know if um, people understand how this plays a huge role in addiction. So today I kind of wanted to go over that topic. So what's the difference? What is guilt versus what is shame, right? Guilt is how we feel about something we've done. It's about our behavior, how we feel about an action. And shame is how we feel about ourselves regarding an action or anything for that matter. So that's the difference. Is the guilt is looking at something external, while shame is in regards to internal and the way that we perceive ourselves and feel about ourselves. So I really wanted to touch upon this. And it's because, again, everyone has guilt and shame, whether we really want to admit it or not, right? We do things, we might say things, believe certain things, and we feel a certain amount of guilt and shame throughout our lifetime. However, a lot of us with addictions, and again, I can only speak for myself because I'm not going to speak on behalf of everybody who struggles with addiction, but I know for me, a lot of it stems from my trauma, and it does for a lot of us, at least from what I've seen in and out of treatment centers with peers and in my education. I've seen this happen or tend to be linked. So, not all, but many of us, our guilt and shame just started from childhood. And this guilt and shame becomes a driving force in our addiction and gets us stuck in this vicious cycle of, you know, a behavior. Well, first of all, a thought of ourselves, then a behavior, and then a consequence. And the guilt and shame is stuck within this cycle that's ongoing. So, um, I really wanted to touch upon this because I believe it's important for everybody to know what the difference is, and also just not the need to justify to people, but to educate people who might not understand how addiction kind of works. And again, this might not be for everybody, but for myself and many of my peers, as well as throughout my education, I've seen this is a huge theme for most of us. So, again, many of us have trauma, especially childhood trauma, and it starts with these negative core beliefs. And if you see me looking up and down, it's because I have like two different cameras. I'm like trying to figure out where to look because I'm trying this whole new setup. So forgive me. Still learning all this stuff. But so negative core beliefs, we all have them. Now we might not all be aware of them, or we might not be aware of, all of them. And this again stems from childhood, because when we're kids, the way that we develop this perception of ourselves is through the way other people either perceive us or through the way that they might indirectly say things to us or relay messages to us. Again, they don't have to be direct verbal things that are said, such as, wow, you're really not good enough. I mean, not many people tell you that. It's kind of just this belief that we develop again in childhood because we grow up in maybe an environment in which we're made to feel like we're not good enough. Whether they mean to do this or not is a whole other issue. But that's where it comes from. We're not born with these negative core beliefs about ourselves. We're just not. When you're born into this world, you're like a clean slate. Or at least that's what a lot of like psychoanalytic and psychodynamic theorists, psychologists, what have you, believe. And then our experiences are what really shape our perception of ourselves, our perception of others, and the perception of the world in general. Um, and if you're having childhood experiences that are creating these negative core beliefs, such as I'm not good enough, I'm stupid, I can't do anything, I'm never going to amount to anything, I'm worthless, I'm helpless, I'm not lovable, things like that. Those are key components of what make up these negative core beliefs for a lot of us who are struggling with addiction or who have struggled with addiction, or and for those of us, for those of you who haven't too. We all can experience those thoughts and beliefs. And we'll go into that a little more about like why some might end up with struggling with an addiction and others might not. But um what I really wanted to touch on is how these core beliefs shape our perception, again, of ourselves, others, and the world, which then leads to automatic negative thoughts, or ants, as we like to call them in the field. Um, and these automatic negative thoughts um, tend to be, a lot of the time, wrapped in guilt and shame. Um, and some, again, are subconscious. We're not aware of them. They're in the unconscious parts of ourselves, and others we are aware of, and to some degree. And this is continuing this cycle of guilt and shame. Um, Now, in CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, they believe, well, it's called cognitive, then behavioral for a reason, because they believe that cognition, our thoughts, right, are what drive feelings, and then those feelings impact how we decide to act and behave. So a lot of times in treatment, we will work on, and this is, whether you struggle with addiction or not, just with CBT in general. One of the main types of techniques used is something called a behavioral analysis chain. Um, and this is when we have a client really, you know, write down some of their triggers, right? Or we focus on one event that occurred, most recent as possible, or one that's like really like bothering them, maybe even if it's further in the past. But we write down what this trigger was, or antecedent, what provoked the thought, the automatic negative thought or core belief. And then from there, once we figure out what that event was, or trigger, we go into having them, and this is all written out in front. I like to do it on like either a whiteboard, a chalkboard, something so that the client can come up and physically write it themselves, because honestly, I know for myself, I do better when I'm seeing things like right in front of my face, written down, and it's, you know, just putting hand to, well, not paper, but you know what I mean? Like, there's this lady who does TED Talks. I can't think of her name. I think it's Mel Robbins. But she's fire. You should listen to her. Very motivational. But she always talks about marry your idea, which means like putting it down, because there's something that happens when we physically take an idea and write it rather than just like keeping it up here. So it's the same with this. We like to have, I like to, when I've done it, have them write it out themselves, because it seems to be more cathartic, and might trigger a connection for them, and some insight, and self-awareness. So from the thought, they would be like, oh, I saw, I don't know, I'm trying to think of something good. Let's say, they saw, we'll keep it as simple as possible. They saw a baggie on the ground, and it reminded them of a bag of dope or something, right? That's the trigger. That's the event. Then we go into the thoughts column. Okay. What thoughts came up? Right? What thoughts came up? And then they would go into, oh, that looks really good. Maybe just one, or maybe I shouldn't. It would be bad if I did this, but I really want to, whatever the thought is, right? And then we go into the next column, which is feelings. And the feelings piece of it is, so when that thought popped up, what feeling was provoked? Was it anxiety? Was it sadness? Was it worry? Was it nervousness? Was it depression? Was it anger? Was it resentment? Was it maybe even happiness a little bit, or excitement, anticipation, whatever? We're trying to get them to see the link between those thoughts and the feelings. And then the next part is the behavior column. And that's when they write down, so what did you do? When this happened, you saw the baggie, you had these thoughts, you were feeling like this. What'd you do? How'd you act? And then it's either, most of the time, I call my dealer, I broke down and I got fucking high. Or it's, I ruminated about it all night long. Or it's just, I decided to go for a walk or something like that. So we want them to see how it's all connected, their thoughts, their feelings, their behaviors. Once we do that, we can then look at like the consequences column. Now there's both positive and negative consequences. Usually when we hear consequence, right, we assume negative, but there are positive consequences to using. And an example might be, excuse me, it took their pain away. It took their anxiety away. It made them feel less depressed. It numbed them. It made them feel normal. That's a positive consequence of using. And then we would have them look at the negative consequences. Okay, so I relapsed. I lost, time clean that I had, or I lost my job. I ended up losing my job because of it, because I ended up relapsing and I couldn't hold my job anymore, or I had to drop out of school, whatever. The point of it is that we are trying to, in CBT, make that connect those connections with them, and not for them, but to help them, guide them to make the connections and see what they are, and see how vital it is that we work on those automatic negative thoughts and the core beliefs. Because that was just like kind of a simple example, but if we were to just analyze some negative thoughts, like I'm a piece of crap, or I'm not good enough, I can't do this. Most of the time, when someone goes to relapse, or they stay stuck in the addiction, it's not because they're having positive thoughts about themselves. Let's get real. Because when a person who's struggling with addiction gets so far deep, it's ruining every aspect of their life. So, I mean, it, it's usually not because they're thinking highly of themselves that they're putting this poison into their body and ruining their life. Let's just keep it, at that. So, really, our perception impacts our feelings, which in turn impacts our behaviors. And this is huge for those with addictions and not just substances, because again, we tend to assume that addiction is talking about just drugs or alcohol, but really it could be anything. It could be food, it could be sex, money, gambling, the lifestyle of being a drug dealer. That's an addiction too. There's so many different things that we forget about, but um, I mean, I guess I'll move on to the next thing that I wanted to talk about, which is if we all have negative beliefs at times of ourselves, others in the world, why do some of us lean towards using substances or engage in other addictive behaviors and others don't? Well, first of all, I just want to say I think all of us have an addiction to something, especially nowadays with all the technology, whether it's our phone, tablet. Uh, I, my wife is addicted to her Kindle, which I didn't even think. Not that it's a bad addiction. I don't think that's like necessarily a bad one. But she loves to read, and she'll get caught up in her books and read like a bunch of them in a row, not realizing what time it is. Um, and that's not really necessarily an unhealthy addiction. So, but what I'm saying is there's all different types, um, not just drugs and alcohol. So, what plays a role in that? Well, first of all, sometimes before I even touch on that, I just want to again remind people that even though some of us go to addictive uh, coping mechanism, there are other ways that these negative core beliefs and automatic thoughts are manifested like in other maladaptive behaviors. They're just not seen as things that interfere with people's functioning as much. So we don't really make people feel shameful about them. And people don't usually feel guilty about it because we've, for example, at least in our society here in the US, have really romanticized like this perfectionism thing, this being a workaholic or um, an overachiever. We see that as a good thing. So that's one thing. There's people who have OCD tendencies, not necessarily actually obsessive compulsive disorder, but some tendencies of, which go along with the perfectionism, and also, control issues, people who are control freaks, right? That's a way that these negative core beliefs and negative thoughts can manifest themselves, or self-harm behavior, eating disorders, relationships, anger, promiscuity, even isolation. Um, these are all other maladaptive ways in which the guilt and shame can impact our lives. And we might not focus on those as much because, again, they're more like socially acceptable than using heroin. So, um, or just to point out, there's also positive outlets. So there are people who channel their negative core beliefs or their guilt and shame, rather, when they do have it, into some more of a positive outlook or outlet, rather, sorry, such as sports or extracurricular activities. Some people might join like theater, or they go hiking, or they're very spiritual, they meditate, things of that nature. So it doesn't always have to be a negative. Some people are able to channel that into something more positive, and I'm going to get into that in a minute. Don't mind me. I have my little notebook here because I'm a perfectionist. I want to make sure I'm touching on things that I want to talk about to you guys. So why do some turn to addictive behaviors and others do not? Well, first, it depends on genetic predisposition, I believe. There is some genetic component to this. I don't think it's fully genetic, but I do believe there is like a predisposition, in our DNA, some of us. Again, I've mentioned it before. If you haven't looked it up or heard of it, epigenetics. I talk about this guy all the time, but Gabor Mate on YouTube, Google, I'm telling you, would not be disappointed. He always talks about epigenetics and how we can have DNA for certain things, for certain issues, but they might not be triggered unless our environment does so. So I believe this to be true with addiction. So does he and many other people in the field, which explains why some people can, again, be in the same family and they're not all addicts. Or I hate saying that, but struggle with addiction rather. Secondly, it depends on what happened after the trauma, because again, we all have trauma. I think everyone in our lives go through something traumatic at some point. It's just, whether or not we want to acknowledge that. And again, my peers, myself, and in the field, I've seen many, 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 if not most or all, people struggling with addiction have trauma. Again, you might not have gotten to the point where you can acknowledge it and recognize it and deal with it. That's a whole other issue, to be honest. But again, it depends on what happens after the trauma. So first of all, what type of trauma was it? Was this a single event type of trauma, like a disaster or something like that, or just one event of abuse? Like, what was it? Or was it chronic, or as they call it now, complex trauma, where it's not necessarily the same type of trauma, but it can be. That's repeated over and over. It's like the person gets knocked down, they finally get back up, and they get knocked down again. And they get up and they get knocked down again. It's just like one boom, 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 where they haven't even been able to deal with the first trauma before the next one's coming down on top of them, like a wave almost, when you get pulled down by the current. That's how I like to think of it. But so which type of trauma was it? Not saying one's worse than the other, because trauma is trauma. It's all shitty. It doesn't matter. But I just say that because the complex trauma does, impact our brain differently, and those neural pathways than, a one event type of trauma would. Now also, once you figure that out, what was your surroundings like after? What was your experience after the traumatic experience? And again, Gabor brings this up a lot too, that trauma is not what happens to us, right? The traumatic event, that's what happened. That's describing the event. That's describing what happened to us that we took as being traumatic, right? So the trauma is actually what happens to us, during and after, how we internalize it. Again, this goes along with this. Do you have positive relationships or connections surrounding you afterwards to help build you back up, to help give you that support and make you feel safe enough to where you can process these issues in a safe environment where you're not going to feel judged, and have open discussions about it? Or are you in an environment where you are being made to feel guilty or shameful and you're having to shove it down because if you talk about it, you're going to get shit for it, or your parent or whoever might tell you, like, suck it up, it's not a big deal. Like, it's like, are you being validated? Are you being invalidated? There's so many pieces to this. Those are the types of things that make a difference in whether or not someone might end up triggering that predisposition to become addicted to something and use, an addictive behavior as an outlet rather than someone who uses sports as an outlet, let's say. Now, besides that, a big piece of this that I'm not going to discuss fully in today's episode because it's a lot, and I don't want to make these episodes too long, but is family dynamics and how your family system operates. That plays a huge role. And depending on how your family or culture even believes in things like therapy or asking for help from the outside for like other resources, you might not get the help that you need. And that's sad. Again, whether it's a culture thing or it's just because maybe your parents, the way that they were raised, weren't able to recognize the help that you needed because they couldn't even give themselves the help. So, that's not making an excuse because it's not okay. And I'm speaking again on my own self, on my behalf. It's, needing to validate that it wasn't okay, that you didn't get the help you needed. But that's another role. That plays another role. That plays an integral piece of why, like, maybe I developed the addictive behavior and my sister didn't or whatever. So those are just some of the things that can really impact how, like, which way someone might go. And again, I'm not going to speak for everybody. I can't generalize this. Everyone's just so different. But from just my own experiences and hearing from peers and people in the rooms when I was, attending meetings and in and out of treatment centers, as well as working in the field. I've heard this over and over and over again. It's just a common theme. And there's a lot of research on it too. So I have that to back it up. But I don't want anybody watching this to think that I'm just trying to generalize and assume that everyone, because I know, again, there's no cookie cutter. There's no one thing for all of us. So, so going into this last piece that I'm going to talk about, again, I'm not going to go too deep into it, but I just wanted to bring it up just to bring it to everyone's attention to just get that seed planted a little bit for you. So many of us with addictive behaviors come from very dysfunctional and toxic families. Now, again, I'm not talking shit. I'm not saying your family is horrible and like condemning them or whatever. However, I'm just stating from my own experience and what I've seen and my experiences personally and professionally that a lot of us, well, let's just put it this way. They don't say that addiction is a family disease for no reason. There's reasons for this. There's data, there's research that has shown that many of us have come from families that even if there wasn't like specific types of abuse, like physical, verbal, sexual, whatever, the toxicity and the horrible toxic communication and dysfunction in the family play a role in someone developing an addictive behavior. So, and this is not to blame, never blaming the family. I'm never putting the blame on like anyone else, but it's, important to acknowledge like everything as a whole. And unfortunately, they play a role, whether they want to admit it or not. And it might be hard for you to admit that your family has played a role too, because nobody wants to have to admit that about their family. It's a shitty kind of a shitty realization. but it is what it is. That's just what it is. And until we like acknowledge it, that's just a piece you need, or I needed to at least acknowledge before I could move forward in my healing. And I'm still working on it. There's a lot to work through. But I find that I find compassion and empathy for them when I'm not blaming, but rather just acknowledging, okay, this is what it was. This was their shit. This is my shit. I still decided to use these coping mechanisms, and it led me down a really dark, shitty path. But I still can't blame, you know. Um, I have to look at my part in it. And there's some things that I didn't have a part in. Like there's no part that we play in abuse or mistreatment as a child or at any point in our lives. So, but yeah, so depending on the role we're played, which most of us who struggle with addiction fall into the scapegoat role or the problem child, right? And that's not abnormal because the family system in general isn't functioning properly to begin with. And then so you develop this addiction in response to that dysfunction. And it's almost like the family subconsciously like clings on to it because, oh, it's not us. We're not the problem. They're the problem. You're the reason why all of our problems exist. And you become the scapegoat. So you're the problem and you're also the scapegoat and the person that they deflect all their shit onto, so that they don't have to look at themselves. Just keeping it real. I know people aren't going to want to hear this. It's, but that is what it is. Let's just call a spade a spade. Let's call it for what it is. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's just how family dynamics work sometimes, especially when the parents have their own shit they haven't worked through. It does tend to get taken out on the child. Hence, again, why we experience childhood trauma and have developed guilt and shame and these negative core beliefs because of that guilt and shame, or, along with that guilt and shame. But these sick, toxic family issues really can hinder a person further and exacerbate those feelings of shame. Our core beliefs kind of, like I kind of mentioned in the beginning, develop because of certain messages we're getting from our caretakers when we're younger, whether it's real or imagined, whether it's real or just it was perceived that way. It doesn't matter. If it was perceived a certain way, then that's the child's reality, period. Whether the parent agrees with that or not, it's not up to them. That's why I hate when I'm told like, well, that didn't happen, or, that's not true, or basically made to feel like my feelings aren't real and they're not valid, and that what I experienced didn't happen. It wasn't real. Like I'm crazy. And that's gaslighting, which is a whole other topic. But it's things like that that can continue through a person's life and through these familial relationships. It doesn't just stop once you become an adult. Like your family changes and decides to like respect you a little more and treat you better. It doesn't, I mean, at least not for me, not for a lot of people that I know. That's why, again, it's called a family disease, because we can go through all the treatment we want, therapy, rehab, psychiatric facility, whatever it is, and have all the best coping skills in the world and have done so much work on ourselves. And yet the family stays sick. Because again, they call it a family system for a reason, because it's all like connected. What I do impacts you, you do impacts them, and they impact me. It's like we all play a role. And when you're the center of it and you're the problem and the family's like around you, right? and they're circling you almost like you're, the sun or something. Um, it um, and when you get better or you start to get healthier and you start to break away from the system a little bit, they're grasping because you were the one that was holding their role together. And without you being sick anymore, um, they actually can get sicker. And I've seen it firsthand. Just because you get better doesn't mean that everyone else does. And that's a hard, hard, hard truth and reality to swallow. Um, because even if you want to build healthier relationships with people, they're not always capable just because you are now. And that sucks because you think, well, I guess you know what, for me, like I always thought that like because I was the problem, oh, you are the problem. So if you get better, um, everything's gonna get better. And it's not true because that's not what happened. And it's actually even more hurtful now for me sometimes that I am better or healthier, because now I don't have a substance to numb myself out from dealing with it. I have to sit with it. It's a really uncomfortable feeling. It's just a shitty, shitty feeling when you've done a lot of work on yourself to reach a point where you thought like things might change with them, and you come to the realization that it wasn't really you after all. Not on your own, at least. It wasn't you. Um, so you can't fix it on your own either, just because you're getting better. Um, and again, the guilt and shame still stays. I've been clean over a little over 4 years, and again, I have a lot of work to go, but I've done a lot of work so far on myself, and it's the guilt and shame is less and less for sure. And when I feel it, I don't get that urge to numb myself out from it like I used to. However, it's still there at times, and especially when trying to attempt to put boundaries up with toxic people in my life, especially when they're family. Um, it's because it was so ingrained, that guilt and shame, you know, it is hard to break out of that pattern. And that is why a lot of us still stay in our addictions. That's why a lot of us stay in it for so long or don't ever come out of it and get better. Because we feel so shitty about ourselves. It takes a lot to build that up. And if you're not in a place like and don't have the support, and it's just hard to do it on your own. And even if you do get there, one little thing can throw you right back into that. So it does. It takes a lot of work. It takes practice, but the problem is that for us, practice, you know, uh, practice doesn't always equal perfection. Practice can equal death because relapse after relapse, trying and trying and trying. Um, Even if you don't want to die, shit happens and you get a bad bag of something and you're done. So it's like some serious shit. Um, but we stay in this cycle of wanting to stop because we know that we deserve better, um, deep down, and not wanting to live that way anymore. But then feeling guilt and shame over the things we've done and who we are because of the things we've done. And then it just reiterates those negative core beliefs. I'm not good enough. I'm a piece of shit. I'll never amount to anything, la, la, la. So we get high again to numb those negative things out. It's like just a vicious cycle. It's crazy. I don't know if anyone else can relate. or not, but I would really love to hear your thoughts on this and experiences. So please feel free to comment. If anyone, again, I really want this to be a collaborative thing. So if anybody would like to come on the show, join me for an episode to share your thoughts and experiences and education from, whatever perspective it is. Maybe you're not the person struggling with the addiction and you want to come on and give your perspective from either working in the field or maybe you have a family member, whatever it is, or you're just curious to learn that too. Because I think psychoeducation is huge for everyone, not just people in the field or for clients. And that's how we can change things on a systemic level, is by continuing to educate each other on things and to be open to new ways of thinking. So I hope you guys enjoyed this episode on guilt and shame. I'm going to try to hopefully go into the family systems discussion a little bit further, specifically pertaining to, the person with the addiction being the problem in the family, and how that can truly, truly impact things. Before I go, I just kind of wanted to end by saying, so what can we do? What do we do from this point, right? How can we help someone who is struggling with addiction to get over this guilt and shame and not allow this guilt and shame to weigh them down anymore? Well, we can help them to confront the traumas, first of all. First and foremost, that has to be done because we need to get to the root problem. And that, for the majority of us, is the root problem. And in doing so, this includes helping them to face the guilt and shame. And we can do this by, again, CBT, DBT, dialectical behavioral therapy, teaching, different skills for distress tolerance and interpersonal relationships, mindfulness and things like that can help as well with that guilt and shame stuff. And also, there's something called inner child work. And I'm sure plenty of you in the field have heard this. And some of you who have gone to treatment might have actually done this or heard of it at least. And this is where the therapist tries to work, or clinician rather, tries to work with the client on healing that little child, the child version of themselves, and the trauma that they went through, where, that time period where they developed those negative core beliefs and automatic negative thoughts and guilt and shame, and developed this certain perception of themselves, others in the world, that led to them, you know, engaging in maladaptive behaviors that were destructive. And don't forget, at the time, those were survival skills that they engaged in. Those were things that helped them as a child to get through what they were going through. As we grow up into adulthood, they tend to work against us and have an adverse effect, and actually can cause us to have problems and functioning and interpersonal problems and stuff like that. So in the beginning, it was helpful, just, towards later on in life, it's not so helpful anymore. But yeah, working on that inner child work, I know I've done things like write a letter to my inner child. Like, I remember I was told one time in a treatment center, to say all the things to your, 5-year-old self, or whatever age the trauma started, that you wish someone had said to you then. Say all the things that you deserve to have been said, or write a letter to your child saying to them what you wish you had known that you know now. It's very deep, very emotional, but extremely cathartic and healing. But to me, that's one of the main things that has helped me. And then I still have a lot to go. There's still a lot of that little child in there is still hurting here and there. So it's again, progress, not perfection. And then I think the last thing that I wanted to kind of say is that to help the client to build their self-esteem back, they need they've had so many losses in their life, and that continually ingrained this, "I'm not good enough. I'll never amount to anything. I'm helpless, and I'm not capable. I'm not lovable." Th There's so many things that happen to build it up to where it is when they first try to get help, right? So helping the client to reach these little goals, little. I remember in sober living, my house manager would always say that making your bed every day made a difference, and keeping your room clean. And a lot of the girls would bitch about this because they didn't understand. Um, and I remember her saying most of the girls who relapse or fuck up in some way, break the rules or something, and leave the house or get kicked out is because they didn't make their bed and they didn't keep their room clean. And it's because making your bed and keeping your room clean is like a reflection of you and how you feel about yourself. Because if you're living in a dirty, disgusting room, what does that say about how you feel about yourself? I never really thought of it like that until then. So, because I'm a perfectionist and wanted to please, I made sure my bed was always made and my room was always tidy. I'm still here. And I'm actually the only one out of my crew that was there, um, that stayed clean. Um, I'm not saying it's only because I kept a clean room, but that those little things, because I did do that, because I wasn't like that before. I was a slob. So doing those little things made me be like, oh, I feel good about myself just doing this and acknowledging something small like that. But it did make a difference. It really did. And helping the client to reach these little tiny goals that seem minute maybe at the time, but like to them, they might be like, what's the big deal? But like, it's a big deal. You can't go to the highest goal, like the hardest thing right away. You have to start small. And these little wins for them instead of losses is what's going to help them to start to build self-confidence and self-esteem and self-love and self-efficacy and belief that like, hey, I can do this. I am lovable. I am good enough. So that's my little rant for today. But again, thank you for tuning in. I just want to remind everyone, I am not a licensed therapist yet, so please do not substitute this for therapy or take it as suggestions or advice. And check me out at my website, www.whatsyourstuff.com. I'm also on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and a bunch of other things. If you just Google it, it should come up. I'm on YouTube now, my YouTube channel. Everybody has stuff. I'm on Instagram, Facebook. Everybody has stuff, and TikTok. I believe What's Your Stuff. And yeah, you can reach out to me here on my videos in the comment section or on one of those platforms. So thank you so much again. And I really am excited for you guys to tune in for the next time. Later. Much love.